In 1763, Viscount Fairfax spent more on a dessert course for 18 people than he paid his housekeeper, the highest earning female servant in his household, annually. The 5 pyramids of wet and dry sweetmeats cost him £16, while he only paid his housekeeper £13. And while the 18th century elite are famous in popular media today for their extravagant dinner parties, their tables, laden with food made by small armies of servants, not much thought is given to what the tenant farmer living on the aristocrat's land might have eaten, or the mantua maker, or the carpenter. What did these ordinary people eat? Hi, my name is Bose. I have an MA in Early Modern English History, and on this channel, we talk about the history you don't learn about in school. And this week, we're going to talk about what ordinary people ate in 18th century England. Would you eat 18th century bread? What were some popular 18th century dishes? How did the North-South divide affect food? Would you eat 18th century bread? For a lot of people, for a long time, bread made up the main basis of their diet. Bread and bacon, bread and cheese, bread and butter. Just plain bread. Many people had it for multiple meals a day, or as their only meal for the day. In city areas like London, where there was no hedgerows or woodlands or commons for people to scavenge from, bread made up the bulk of people's diets. Maybe with a bit of cheese if they could afford it, or butter. And it would have been washed down with ale. Bread in the 18th century was not like bread as we know it today. The flour used was much coarser, it had much higher bran content, and bakers would often bulk it out with other ingredients, such as chalk, in order to make it cheaper. Hence the need for people to wash it down with ale. Many households preferred bread to porridge, because porridge cooked on thin tin saucepans could easily burn. In the West Country, many wives and children of the poorest families survived on something called tea kettle broth, which was bread soaked in either water or milk. Social ideas about household hierarchy in the 18th century meant that the best food was reserved for the man, the head of the household, and wives and children were given the lesser food. What were some popular 18th century dishes? What people ate could vary dramatically, depending on their social status, location, the season, and whether they were able to produce their own food. Whether that was through farming or cottage gardening, or by having access to woodland and hedgerows that they could scavenge from. Many families did have more than just bread on the table though. And one very popular dish was pottage, which could be made with cereals or grains or beans, pretty much anything. Pottage was a very thick soup, or some might call it a stew, and it was thickened with either grains or breadcrumbs, and it was a very popular dish across Northern Europe. Dumplings, pies and puddings were also commonly found on tables. But meat was much less common, and for many would have only been eaten on very special occasions and holidays, such as Christmas or Easter, and for the better off, might have made an appearance on the table on a Sunday. In early modern England, the amount of beef a family could afford to eat was a social status indicator, and it had been since the Norman era. And so, the family who had it on the table regularly definitely had something to brag about. While most families might not have been able to afford beef regularly, there were 2 meats commonly found on the 18th century table: bacon and salted pork. Bacon and salted pork could be used to liven up a variety of dishes, and both were cured meats, meaning they lasted longer during a time before fridges. One thing that salted pork was commonly paired with in the 18th century was peas. They were a bit mad about peas in the 18th century, mainly because dried peas had a very long shelf life and could help see a family through winter. Peas pottage, which was a thick soup, was very common. Peas pudding, which was an even thicker soup, boiled in a cloth to keep its shape and eaten as a savoury dish, was also very popular. And peas and salted pork went together beautifully, because both require a very long boiling time, and the peas will absorb some of the salt from the salted pork, making the dish tastier and more pleasant to eat. Peas and pork were eaten widely across England, and in fact, England's first fish and chip shop in Lancashire started out life as a pig trotter and pea soup hut, which were popular and commonly found in market towns and cities across England. Those living in the countryside greatly relied on the hedgerows, woodlands, and the commons in order to enrich their diets, whether it was by scavenging for food in the hedgerows or the woodlands, or grazing their cattle on the commons, or by getting firewood from the woods. The commons were an integral part of rural life in the early 18th century. Many people relied on these areas for their food, and they would suffer when the Enclosure Acts passed in early modern England prevented them from accessing the land, particularly those acts passed between 1750 and 1860. 20%, or a fifth of England's land, would become enclosed. This would result in rural unemployment, migration to cities, as well as food shortages. However, in the long term, Enclosure Acts meant that larger farms could produce more food, and more supply of food would eventually lead to lower food prices. How did the North-South divide affect food? In the mid to late 18th century, industry began to rise in the north. As a result, landowners had to compete for employees with these industries, meaning that employees could command higher wages. Food was also just generally cheaper in the north than it was in the south. So, northern neighbours had access to cheaper food and higher wages to buy it with. So generally, they were better fed than their southern counterparts. Differing farming practices in Cumbria, Lancashire and Yorkshire meant that families in those counties had greater access to milk and oats, generally leading to a higher standard of nutrition in those counties than in their southern counterparts. While southern men might have received just bread for breakfast, mind you, breakfast was still a relatively new invention in the 18th century. By the end of the 18th century, northern men likely would have had a piece of bacon with their bread, and maybe even a cup of tea or coffee. That is not to say that all northerners were well fed in the 18th century, and all southerners were starving. But more that, people living in northern England were more likely to receive higher wages and had access to cheaper food prices, meaning that they were more likely to have a more nutritious and varied diet than their southern counterparts. Now, you might have noticed that I have not mentioned the one food that pretty much every TV and movie adaptation of the past has ordinary people eating: the potato. Now, while the potato was introduced to Europe in the 16th century, it hadn't caught on in England by the 18th century with ordinary people. A lot of people were deeply suspicious of the potato in England. This was for a number of reasons, one of which was that it belongs to the nightshade family of plants, so many people believed it was poisonous. People also believed that the uneven skin of the potato could cause leprosy. There was also a very strong association of the potato with the Irish, which, at a time when there was a lot of English prejudice against the Irish, made it very unpopular among some English people. However, by the late 18th century and early 19th century, the potato did rise in popularity, particularly in the north of England, when people started to realise that A, it wasn't poisonous or would give them a disease, and that it was a relatively cheap food that was filling. We have records of it starting to appear in markets, notably in Manchester. Today we have discussed some of the food that ordinary people ate in 18th century England. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. That's all I have for you for now. Bye!